December 15, 1944. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The morning mist clung to the frozen earth like a shroud, carrying with it the acrid smell of cordite and the metallic tang of blood. Through the skeletal branches of war-torn trees, the pale winter sun cast long shadows across a landscape that had become a graveyard of ambitions. In a hastily erected American field hospital, barely 2 miles behind what had been the front line just hours before, the sounds of human suffering echoed through canvas walls, moans in German, prayers in English, and the rhythmic clatter of medical instruments that knew no nationality. Obergefreiter Hans Müller lay on a stretcher, his left leg mangled by shrapnel from an American artillery shell. The 22-year-old machine gunner from Bavaria had awakened to find himself surrounded not by the SS officers he expected to court-martial him for being captured, but by American soldiers wearing red crosses on their helmets. What he witnessed in the following hours would shatter every carefully constructed belief the Third Reich had planted in his mind about the nature of his enemies. The Battle of the Bulge had begun with such promise. Hitler's final gamble in the West, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was meant to recapture the port of Antwerp and split the Allied forces in two. For weeks, German propaganda had filled the ears of soldiers like Müller with tales of inevitable victory, of American cowardice, and of the racial superiority that would surely triumph over the mongrel armies of democracy. The German High Command had assured them that the Americans, soft from their comfortable lives, would break and run when faced with true Germanic resolve. Yet here, in this makeshift hospital that smelled of ether and hope, Müller watched as Lieutenant Sarah Henderson, a nurse from Ohio, knelt beside his stretcher with the same gentle precision she had shown the American GI on the adjacent cot. Her hands, steady despite 36 hours without sleep, cleaned his wounds with a tenderness that defied everything he had been taught about his captors. When she spoke to him in broken German, asking about his pain, her voice carried no hatred, no contempt, only the professional compassion of a healer who saw suffering rather than enemy uniform. This was not the America that Dr. Joseph Goebbels had described in his fiery speeches. This was not the weak, morally corrupt nation that German soldiers had been told would collapse at the first sign of true adversity. As Müller watched Lieutenant Henderson work, offering him water from her own canteen when medical supplies ran low, he began to understand that he had been fighting not just a war, but a lie. The German offensive had initially caught American forces off guard. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops supported by 600 tanks had smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. The surprise was total, the initial success undeniable. German soldiers, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, had expected to find the same demoralized, poorly equipped enemy that Nazi propaganda had promised them. Instead, they encountered an adversary whose industrial might had only grown stronger with each passing month of war. What struck German prisoners most profoundly was not American military prowess, though that was formidable, but American abundance. Even in field hospitals under combat conditions, there seemed to be no shortage of medical supplies, food, or basic human decency. Sergeant Klaus Weber, captured during the fighting around Bastogne, would later write in his memoir, "They gave us the same medical attention as their own wounded. When I asked why, the American doctor simply said, 'Because you're hurt.' It was the first time in years someone had seen me as human, rather than as a cog in the war machine. The symbolic power of American abundance manifested itself in the smallest gestures. When German POWs arrived at aid stations, American medics routinely offered them chocolate bars from their rations. Real chocolate, not the ersatz substitute that had become a bitter reminder of Germany's increasing isolation. These small brown squares, stamped with Hershey's in letters that German soldiers couldn't read, became tangible proof of an industrial capacity that seemed limitless. Where German rations had grown progressively smaller and more synthetic as the war progressed, American soldiers carried enough surplus to share with their enemies. Dr. Patricia Walsh, an Army nurse who served in 3 different field hospitals during the Battle of the Bulge, recorded in her diary the profound impact these encounters had on German prisoners. They arrive expecting brutality, having been told that Americans torture captives and that our democracy is a facade hiding our true barbarism. Instead, they find themselves in clean beds, receiving the same pain medication as our own boys. eating hot food that many of them haven't tasted in months. The look in their eyes changes from fear to confusion to something approaching wonder. The transformation in German prisoners' perceptions often began with their first American meal. While German soldiers had been subsisting on increasingly meager rations, black bread mixed with sawdust, potato soup thinned to transparency, and coffee made from acorns, American field kitchens served portions that seemed impossibly generous. Corporal Friedrich Zimmermann, captured near St. Vith, described his first meal in American custody. "They gave me more meat than I had seen in 6 months, vegetables that were actually green, and bread made from real wheat. When I couldn't finish it all, they told me I could have more if I wanted. I thought it was some kind of test, but the guard was genuinely puzzled by my hesitation. 'There's plenty,' he said, as if abundance was the natural state of the world." This abundance extended beyond mere calories to encompass a fundamentally different relationship with material resources. German prisoners observed American soldiers discarding equipment that German forces would have considered precious. Half-empty cigarette packages were tossed aside without thought. Worn uniforms were replaced rather than mended. Medical supplies were used generously rather than hoarded. The casual wastefulness that appeared shocking to German eyes was actually evidence of an industrial base so vast that scarcity had become an alien concept, yet it was not American wealth alone that transformed German perceptions. It was the democratic values that wealth served. Lieutenant Henderson and her fellow nurses treated German prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, not because they were forced to, but because their training and their values demanded it. American medical personnel had been raised in a society that viewed individual human dignity as sacred, regardless of nationality or ideology. This philosophical foundation, made possible by economic abundance, created a stark contrast with the Nazi ideology that had shaped German soldiers' worldview. The Nazi state had taught its soldiers that democracy was weakness, that compassion was racial betrayal, and that only through pitiless struggle could true strength emerge. Yet here were American nurses, products of that supposedly weak democratic system, working 18-hour shifts to save the lives of enemy soldiers. Here were American doctors sharing their limited morphine supplies with German patients. Here were American orderlies, many of them barely out of high school, treating captured Wehrmacht veterans with the same respect they showed their own comrades. Captain Ernst Hoffmann, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, found his entire worldview crumbling during his 2 weeks in an American field hospital. "I had seen what we did to captured partisans in Yugoslavia," he wrote years later. "I had witnessed the treatment of Soviet prisoners on the Eastern Front. I expected Americans to behave as we had behaved, to show the same hardness that we believed was necessary for victory. Instead, they showed me that strength could coexist with mercy, that victory could be achieved without abandoning humanity." The contrast was particularly stark for German soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front, where warfare had devolved into a racial war of extermination. The Wehrmacht's own records document the systematic brutalization of Soviet prisoners, the deliberate starvation of civilian populations, and the casual execution of anyone deemed racially or politically undesirable. These same soldiers, transported to American aid stations, found themselves in an entirely different moral universe, one where enemy wounded received the same medical attention as friendly forces, where international Red Cross protocols were scrupulously observed, and where individual conscience could override military expediency. The chocolate bars that American soldiers shared became more than mere food. They became symbols of a civilization that could afford generosity even in wartime. These small luxuries, distributed casually by teenage GIs to captured German veterans, represented the kind of surplus that only a truly free and prosperous society could maintain. Each chocolate bar was a tangible reminder that while Germany's economy had been stripped bare to feed the war machine, America's industrial capacity had grown stronger with each passing year. Some German prisoners initially refused American medical treatment, convinced it was a trap or a prelude to torture. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Krauss, wounded in the fighting around Malmedy, spent his first day in American custody waiting for interrogation, beatings, or worse. Instead, he received a tetanus shot, clean bandages, and a meal that included real coffee, not the chicory substitute that had become standard in Germany. When he expressed suspicion about the food, believing it might be poisoned, An American medic sat down and ate from the same rations to demonstrate their safety. It was such a simple gesture, Krauss later recalled, but it shattered months of indoctrination in a single moment. The American approach to prisoner treatment reflected deeper philosophical differences about the nature of warfare itself. While Nazi ideology viewed war as a fundamental struggle between superior and inferior races, American military doctrine, shaped by democratic values and Christian ethics, maintained the possibility of honorable conduct even in combat. This distinction manifested itself in countless small interactions. American guards who learned basic German medical terms to better communicate with prisoners, nurses who wrote letters home for wounded Germans who couldn't hold a pen, doctors who spent their off-duty hours checking on enemy patients. Dr. Michael Roberts, chief medical officer at a field hospital near Bastogne, observed the psychological transformation of German prisoners with clinical fascination. They arrived expecting brutality and found compassion. They expected scarcity and found abundance. Most profoundly, they expected to be treated as subhuman enemies, and instead were treated as fellow human beings who happened to be wounded. The cognitive dissonance was visible in their faces. You could actually watch their preconceptions crumble in real time. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 34 days and cost both sides enormous casualties. When it ended, American forces had not only repelled Germany's last major offensive but had captured thousands of German prisoners whose perceptions of America and democracy had been fundamentally altered. These men returned to Germany carrying stories that contradicted years of Nazi propaganda, stories of American abundance, American compassion, and American strength that manifested itself through generosity rather than brutality. The impact of these encounters extended far beyond individual transformations. Letters smuggled back to Germany, conversations with fellow prisoners, and eventual repatriation carried the message that America represented something qualitatively different from Nazi portrayals. The GI who shared his chocolate, the nurse who treated enemy wounds with the same care as friendly ones, the doctor who saw patients rather than prisoners, these became the true ambassadors of American values, more effective than any propaganda campaign. Staff Sergeant Robert Martinez, who served as a translator at multiple POW collection points, witnessed hundreds of these transformations. The Germans who came through our aid stations left with a completely different understanding of what America represented. They had expected to find weakness and instead found strength. They had expected to find hatred and instead found humanity. Most importantly, they had expected to find a society as brutal as their own and instead found a civilization that could fight total war while maintaining its moral compass. The chocolate bars continued to circulate long after the Battle of the Bulge ended. German prisoners shared them with fellow captives, describing not just the taste, but the casual abundance they represented. American soldiers had chocolate not as a rare luxury, but as standard equipment, issued along with ammunition and medical supplies. This simple fact spoke volumes about the different societies that had produced these opposing armies. One stripped bare by ideological extremism and perpetual warfare, the other grown stronger through democratic resilience and industrial might. American abundance, however, was more than mere material wealth. It was the product of a system that valued individual dignity and collective prosperity. The nurses who treated German prisoners with the same care as American soldiers were products of a society that had invested in education, medical training, and professional development, even during wartime. The doctors who shared their expertise across enemy lines reflected a scientific community that viewed knowledge as universal rather than national property. The ordinary soldiers who offered food and comfort to captured enemies embodied values that prioritized human welfare over ideological purity. The transformation of German prisoners' perceptions often occurred in stages. Initial fear gave way to confusion to cautious acceptance, and acceptance to a profound re-examination of everything they had been taught about their enemies. Gefreiter Anton Miller described his journey from Nazi true believer to skeptical observer. I had been taught that Americans were weak, that their democracy was chaos, that their racial mixing had produced an inferior people, but the American soldiers I met were individually stronger, better equipped, and more confident than most of my German comrades. Their democracy had produced not chaos, but coordination on a scale we could barely comprehend. The democratic values that shaped American military conduct were not abstract principles, but practical realities that influenced every aspect of how the war was fought. American commanders who insisted on proper treatment of prisoners were not displaying weakness but strength. The strength of a society secure enough in its values to maintain them even under extreme stress. American nurses who treated enemy wounded were not naive, idealists but professionals, trained in a system that viewed medical ethics as non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. As winter deepened and the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the stories of German prisoners began to spread throughout the Wehrmacht's remaining forces. Soldiers who had been captured and later exchanged carried tales of American medical care, American food, and American treatment that contradicted everything they had been told. These accounts, whispered in trenches and repeated in letters home, began to erode the psychological foundations of Nazi resistance. The impact was particularly pronounced among German medical personnel, who could appreciate the professional competence and ethical standards of their American counterparts. Dr. Karl Brenner, a Wehrmacht surgeon captured during the retreat from the Bulge, spent 3 weeks working alongside American doctors in a field hospital. His post-war memoir describes the experience as a revelation. "I watched American surgeons save German lives with the same skill and dedication they showed their own wounded. They shared their techniques, their medicines, and their knowledge without hesitation. It was my first glimpse of a medical profession that served humanity rather than ideology." The chocolate bars that had become symbols of American abundance were often saved by German prisoners long after they could have been eaten. These small rectangles of sweetness, wrapped in foil that seemed impossibly luxurious to men accustomed to wartime shortages, were kept as tangible proof that another world was possible. A world where abundance could coexist with compassion, where strength could manifest through generosity rather than brutality. Lieutenant Henderson, the nurse from Ohio, whose gentle treatment had first shattered Obergefreiter Miller's preconceptions, continued to serve through the final months of the war. Her patient logs from that period record dozens of German prisoners who recovered under her care, many of whom expressed gratitude that transcended language barriers. Years later, she would receive letters from former patients who had returned to Germany carrying stories of American medical care that contradicted decades of propaganda. The transformation of German prisoners' perceptions represented more than individual conversions. It demonstrated the power of democratic values to transcend national boundaries and ideological differences. The American soldiers, nurses, and doctors who treated captured Germans with dignity and compassion were not following explicit orders but acting according to principles so deeply ingrained that they seemed natural rather than political. These encounters revealed the fundamental difference between societies built on abundance and those built on scarcity, between civilizations that celebrated human dignity and those that subordinated individual worth to state ideology. The German soldiers who experienced American medical care discovered that democracy was not weakness, but strength, that abundance was not accident but achievement, and that compassion was not naivety but wisdom. As the war drew to its close and German prisoners were processed through American detention facilities, the stories they told began to spread throughout occupied Germany. The contrast between Nazi promises and American reality became impossible to ignore. The regime that had promised endless victory had delivered only endless war, while the democracy portrayed as weak and decadent had demonstrated both military superiority and moral consistency. The chocolate bars that American GIs had shared so casually became part of a larger narrative about the kind of society that could fight total war while maintaining its humanitarian principles. Each small gesture of kindness, each moment of professional medical care, each instance of treating enemies as human beings contributed to a profound shift in how Germans understood both America and their own recent history. In the end, the German prisoners who were stunned when American nurses treated them like wounded heroes discovered something more transformative than medical care. They discovered the power of a civilization that could afford to be generous because it was genuinely strong, that could show mercy because it was truly confident, and that could maintain its values because those values were the source rather than the obstacle to its strength. The Battle of the Bulge ended not just with military victory, but with a triumph of ideals made manifest through countless individual acts of compassion. The chocolate bars were consumed, the wounds healed, and the prisoners eventually returned home. But the memory of American abundance, material, moral, and spiritual, lingered long after the war ended, a testament to the enduring power of democratic values to transform even the most bitter enemies into witnesses to the possibility of a better world. In the quiet moments between artillery barrages, in the gentle hands of nurses who saw patients rather than prisoners, in the casual generosity of soldiers who shared their rations with captured enemies, the true strength of America revealed itself, not as propaganda proclaimed it, but as it actually existed, abundant, confident, and secure enough in its own values to extend them even to those who had sought its destruction.